Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Racing News 365 podcast, looking back at last weekend's Mexico City Grand Prix, but also looking ahead to this weekend's race in São Paulo. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined, as always, by 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam, absolutely Coop, and of course, lead editor Ian Parks, the absolute legend who I was with only a few hours ago. Gentlemen, once again, another incredible race in Mexico. Stories from start to finish, most notably on lap 10. So I think before we get right into that, let's kickstart this podcast with our biggest takeaway from the weekend. Sam, we'll come to you first.
My biggest takeaway from the weekend is that the tide is turning on the stewards' interpretation of the driving standards, driving guidelines. I think there hasn't yet been that conversation with all the drivers, but clearly this was a statement of intent from the Mexico City Grand Prix stewards compared when you contrast it against the Austin stewards. So I think that is the biggest take home, is that, you know, there's been a shift here, and it's just interesting to see how long that might stay if there aren't actual changes to the rules.
You've taken my bloody biggest takeaway. I can't believe it. I haven't put it in the Slack chat.
There's only one takeaway to take away from that Grand Prix. There wasn't exactly much else, to be honest.
I didn't see that message.
I took Ian's last week and this week now. And even to try and avoid the situation, to those who are watching, I even put in our company Slack chat, just so you know, guys, I'm taking this as my biggest takeaway. And he's gone and taken it. Right, Ian, you got to go next then, mate, because I'll have to think of a new one.
Quite clearly, Sam did not read the memo in Slack.
He did not.
It must have been recently, because I was getting ready for the podcast. I can only apologise, Nick. I can only apologise.
I'll let you off on this one, but the next time, this one episode of the podcast without you, that's one strike.
Yeah.
What are you getting ready for the podcast? What were you doing? Combing your hair? Combing your beard? I mean, come on.
Putting on a t-shirt that wasn't black, because
that always helps.
You always complain that I look like just a talking head.
This is
when I wear a dark t-shirt. So
it's good to know this is, I think, the 30th episode we've done together, and you're finally realising not to wear a black t-shirt. So we're making progress. 2025 is our year. Ian, quickly get us away from this.
This is what people want to listen to. We give them entertainment. Are you not entertained, people? Come on. Well, basically, Summer's covered it. I mean, the biggest takeaway is that, and Andrea Stella has said it, that the stewards now are on board with the overall interpretation of these driving standards guidelines. Yes, we came out of the United States, and there was a lot of conjecture, a lot of furore around the penalties that were applied or weren't applied in some cases. And we've come into this one now. There was the drivers' briefing on Friday. The FIA had the discussions with all 20 drivers, and a lot of takeaways were taken away from that drivers' briefing. However, the suggestion was they would not be written in stone, shall we say, until the Qatar Grand Prix, for whatever reason. Go figure, not quite sure why we've got to wait until Qatar. I don't know. But at least those conversations were in the minds of the FIA. And now we've come out of this Grand Prix quite clearly with all the information that was taken on board out of Austin, out of Friday's drivers' briefing. And we saw that, yes, the stewards were applying the overall letter of the law as per the driving standards guidelines. Now, the key for the stewards going forward, because we don't have permanent stewards, they rotate, as we know, consistency. Are we going to see consistency going forward? Will what we've seen applied in Mexico City now be applied in now be applied in Sao Paulo, now be applied in Las Vegas? Should we see something very similar over the next 2, 3, 4 Grand Prix that we've got to end this season?
And that actually builds really well.
Take it away.
That builds really well actually on something I was going to mention in my biggest takeaway that Sam kindly stole. Not going to forget that, mate. It's now the point of the stewards. The stewards have gone by the letter of the law, particularly in Mexico City. And it's very much a case of now, until they've adjusted the rules, they've got to keep following the letter of the law. And of course, the challenge is going to be that it's not the same stewards every single week. And of course, Max Verstappen very much found out, in particular in Mexico City, that perhaps he can't exploit that rule the way he's been able to in the past, because he has such a good understanding of the current guidelines. And that's the big thing looking ahead to this weekend in Sao Paulo, is that, one, will the consistency be kept? And two, for me, will drivers still try those style of moves? Because it's not uncommon to see some drivers exceeding track limits in Sao Paulo. There are some corners at Interlagos which do kind of lead into those incidents, looking back at Max and Lewis in 2021, for example. So I think that's something that'll be really interesting to keep an eye on this weekend. And just a quick note to our viewers, thank you so much, because we are seeing an increasing number of you very quickly subscribing to the Racing News 365 channel. If you're not subscribed, please do so, because it'd be amazing to get as many of you involved before the season ends. We've got 4 races to go. Start now. Right. Shall we start?
And I'd just like to add, Nick, I went on a little bit of a rant in our Sunday night update, and I was complaining about the highly negative comments towards both myself and you in the comments section. However, what I have seen, and I'm going to give credit to our viewers and our listeners, is a truly wonderful set of comments below the Sunday evening podcast, and really great engagement between you guys, having a conversation about one another, debating the max penalties and keeping it clean without abusing one another and without abusing, quite obviously, both either myself or Nick. So thank you ever so much for that. Keep those comments coming, because we do appreciate them. And I am going to be referring to a couple of them as we carry on in this podcast as well.
That's brilliant. And that's the thing, guys. We love the positive energy. We love your guys' feedback and actually getting involved in our talking points, because it makes our lives much easier in this podcast, which brings us on quite nicely to Max Verstappen, Lando Norris, lap 10 in Mexico City, turn 4 and then turn 7. We obviously know what happened with the 2 10-second time penalties. And actually, after the instance, we ran a poll on Racing News 365 whether our viewers thought that the penalties were deserved. And this poll has skyrocketed. It has done thousands of votes already. And what's really interesting is actually the audience on the website, and also those who watch our podcasts and videos on YouTube, actually have been raising very similar points. And staggeringly, on the poll, 65% believe that both penalties were deserved. And Sam, I actually want to come to you on this one, because obviously, for those who are unaware, Sam was working the early shift for Racing News 365 over the weekend. So, but because of that, though, similar to the weekend before in Texas, you got the chance to actually sit down properly in your sofa or wherever you decided to watch it and actually enjoy the race without having to work on it. So almost from the fan perspective a little bit more. With that in mind, what did you make of both incidents? Because when Ian and I discussed it in the F1 update early Monday morning after the race on Sunday, we both agreed that actually both incidents were out of line. Martin Brundle said it was outrageous. Max saw red mist. But actually what's interesting is that he received the penalty points for the turn 4 incident rather than the turn 7, which actually, when watching back replays in the race itself, seemed to be the more severe incident of the two.
Well, I hope you've both got some snacks, because I might be here a while on this one.
Here we go.
Blimey.
I think you're absolutely right on the penalty points thing. That is totally bizarre to me that the penalty points were awarded for turn 4 and not turn 7. What I will say is that I think the turn 4 10 seconds is maybe too harsh. I think that was a 5-second time penalty, especially when you look at how that has been applied in the past. It's a 200% increase on what Lando Norris got last weekend, 10 seconds.
But there are reasons for that.
Yeah, but
fights.
There are reasons for that, and the stewards explained it in last week's doc, and they've explained it in this week's doc. 10 seconds is the letter of the law penalty. That is the reason why those 2 10-second penalties were dished out. The reason why only 5 seconds was handed out to Lando last week was because of the positioning of Max's car, and he had, and if I remember rightly from the stewards doc, Lando therefore had no alternative but to go off track. Otherwise, it would have been the 10-second penalty applied to him as well. And of course, looking back on last week, and this was what was the biggest bone of contention, is why was Max not duly punished as well with a similar penalty to Lando? Because, okay, yes, he had the apex of the corner, but he ultimately forced another driver off track. So that was what was, as I say, most of the drivers last week couldn't understand. That has now been addressed, and that's why we saw, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as the stewards are concerned, given the wording of their documents, the 2 10-second penalties, because they are, the bottom line, the letter of the law.
And obviously the big thing as well, very quick, with the turn 4 one compared to obviously the turn 4 was for Max forcing another driver, Lando in this case, off the circuit. Turn 7 was obviously for exceeding track limits and gaining an advantage, and in doing so forced Lando off the track. But crucially with the wording of the stewards for the turn 4, they pointed out that Lando at every point of the corner, both on the entry, on the exit, at the apex itself, Lando was ahead. And that was always the crucial wording, which differed from the circuit of the Americas. And yes, it's an interesting point Sammy raised, because actually there was a lot of people who commented in our videos as well that perhaps for the turn 4, 10 seconds was a bit too harsh. And obviously, Ian, you've just explained brilliantly why actually, answering a lot of our viewers' questions, you just explained brilliantly why it was 10 seconds rather than 5 seconds. But Sam, for you then, going forward to turn 7, do you think 10 seconds for that one was actually harsh enough? Because even some of our viewers have said that actually perhaps, the steward should have gone even further with that one, given, as shown on the replays, Max was never going to make that corner.
Well, this is the point I was going to come on to, is when you contrast the 2 penalties. And Ian, you're absolutely right. No, that is a perfectly fair point. What I was going to say is that I think when you need to have a bit of give and take, I think with these things at points, and understandably the stewards have felt they can't do that this weekend, given what happened in Austin, was that the 10-second penalty at turn 7, I don't think was harsh enough. I think, as Martin Brundle said, there was almost this red mist that descended, and it was aggressive. It was unduly aggressive, and I think they could have gone further than the 10-second penalty there, because there was no attempt really to make the corner, and it felt like Max was trying to basically exact his own retribution, having felt wronged by what happened at turn 4. It felt like he had decided to take it into his own hands, which you absolutely cannot do. And what's really critical here, and this is why we've seen this changing towards this style of racing, is when Max came into F1, he had this brand of wheel-to-wheel racing, and the drivers that were there, long-standing drivers in the sport, were going, "What are you doing?" And as they have kind of retired and moved on, Max has become one of the preeminent drivers in F1. He has become a mover in F1, and the drivers now coming through are starting to follow in those footsteps, because that is the example that is being set. So that's why I think the stewards could have gone further with turn 7. But again, I completely take your point on turn 4. That's fair enough. I just felt that the fact that the two of them had the same consequence was odd. And even for turn 4 then to have the penalty points, I think turn 7 was more egregious in that sense. But yeah, I mean, we're still seeing inconsistencies, right? Perez was involved in 2 incidents, which we may or may not get onto. And
we will.
Neither of those were, well, there you go. We'll discuss them as they come, but neither of those were penalised. Yeah. And I think both of them have distinct differences to them, but nevertheless. So I think, there's a lot to pull out from this, but I think it's good to see that brand of racing starting to be stamped down on, because I do think it ultimately does stop hard racing being possible when you take it over the line in the way that Max has done quite often in the past.
Lando obviously called as well Max's driving dangerous, and something I want to ask you, Ian, because obviously the incident happened just a couple of days after this meeting between the FIA and the drivers to discuss changes to be made to the racing guidelines following Max and Lando's incident at the Circuit of the Americas. It's obviously a lot of the drivers have spoken out more in support of Lando and, kind of calling out Max Verstappen's aggressive driving. Do you think perhaps Max might be feeling a little bit, I don't know if targeted is the right word perhaps, but thinking, hold on guys, this is, almost 19 against 1 almost, because it does feel like it's very much Max's driving and his aggressive style that perhaps, is what's triggered these changes to be made, because quite clearly those who he is racing aren't happy with what's happening on the circuit.
We've been here before, haven't we? If you remember when Max started his career, he was accused then of being a very aggressive driver to such an extent the McLaren team principal at the time, Martin Whitmarsh, described him as the crash hard kid or something along those lines, if I recall correctly, because of the way Max just went about his driving. But I think now, several years on, I think whilst Max is obviously older, wiser, more mature, I also think what he's going through at the minute, or what is being said against him, is just water off a duck's back. I genuinely don't think he will care what other people say or think about him. He's that kind of character, I get the impression. Obviously, I can't say definitively because I don't know Max that well. I'm not a friend or anything like that. But from having reported on Max for so long now, his entire F1 career, and having seen how he has grown up and changed, and as I say, matured into, at the end of the day, a great racing driver. That's the bottom line. I also think that, as I say, this won't mean anything to him. He is just simply doing what he feels is right, particularly, and as I mentioned in the F1 update post-race, the fact that he is pretty much driving effectively handicapped, given the car that he's got right now. It is not the race-winning, pole-claiming car that he had at the start of the season. That's without a shadow of a doubt. That car has fundamentally changed over the course of the period, over the course of this season. And it has meant that he is now having to resort to every single tool in his toolbox to fight for position, to fight at whatever corners come up. And as we've seen over these past two Grand Prix, and in particular in Mexico City, and I'm going to quote somebody, I did say I was going to refer to somebody's comment, and it was a Jeremy Thornton that commented post F1 update on the Sunday, that Max has, as I say, we've taken every tool in his toolbox, and basically now he's taken a sledgehammer as one of those tools to defend his. It amused me. I thought it was quite a funny comment. That's why I brought it up. As I say, to now defend what is going on, because he is seeing that lead now down to 47 points. It's still a big lead to overcome. One DNF could do it, would certainly swing the picture Lando Norris's way. But yes, it's a changed Max, but I don't think for the better in terms of, as I say, in terms of maturity in his driving. But as I again repeat, I don't think these comments will unduly affect him in any way. He will just go out there and deliver the way he knows he has to in order to wrap up this fourth consecutive driver's title this season.
And it did feel a little bit almost, the way he was driving, the aggressive nature in Mexico was almost a last resort, because we saw Sam throughout the Mexico City Grand Prix from FP1 to the race. He was dealing with issues with the RB20 in FP1. It started with sustaining significant floor damage. He then had power unit issues, which continued in FP2. In FP3, he complained of zero grip, did an incredible job in qualifying to get himself on the front row in second, and made a brilliant start to lead into the first corner. But again, during the race, he was complaining of zero grip from the front and the rear. And of course, he's very much fighting for the team on his own, because Sergio Perez, who we will discuss later on, was absolutely nowhere once again. But do you feel that Max is now, because quite clearly Lando has got a better package than Max with the McLaren, do you think Max is resorting to this aggressive driving, going at times beyond the limits? Because he knows that if he's almost within the limits, then Lando's not only going to get past him, but actually take even more points away from him. Because actually, had the instance with Max and Lando not happened, and let's say Lando got ahead cleanly, which otherwise would have gone on, there's a good chance Lando would have actually won that race, because as we saw in the latter stages, he was pretty quick, and quicker than Carlos and Charles.
That's what will justify it to Max. That course of action is exactly that point you've just made. That say he hadn't done that and Lando got past, Lando could have won the race. Max probably would have finished fourth. And that would be a bigger swing in points than we saw between second and sixth. So it's that I think is justifying the behaviour in many ways. Not that that's right, but I think that's certainly an interpretation you can draw. And Max is fighting the car. He's, as you rightly explained, all weekend he's finding it really, really difficult to get on top of. So not only is he doing that, he's then having to fight the guys around him, which he hasn't had to do for a while. So he's on multiple fronts trying to battle here, and it's a lot. Like, he's got a huge capacity, clearly, as we've seen. You don't become a triple world champion without having a capacity to race and to deal with various things in the cockpit. But he's certainly coming up against more than he has done in recent memory. What will be key, though, is that one lap pace, because he is getting himself in qualifying in the positions to at least fight Lando early in the race. And Mexico is a good example of that for the reasons I've already talked about.
Yeah.
He could affect how many points Lando ultimately got. And he was able to return, come back through the field to the extent that, as I said before, it wasn't as bad as if he hadn't made that judgment. It's a net gain for him in some ways.
So very quickly before we go on.
I was going to say, there's clearly been an improvement with the RB20 in terms of one-lap performance. But as we quite clearly have seen in these last two Grand Prix especially, and as Max has clearly pointed out post-Mexico City, the RB20 now is fundamentally lacking in race pace. Certainly in comparison to the progress that Ferrari has made, and definitely, obviously, alongside McLaren as well. And that is crucial now for Max, because if both Ferraris and both McLarens are ahead of him, and it obviously depends where Lando could be in any given Grand Prix over the four coming up, we could be looking race win Lando, fifth Max, and then we're looking at that point swing that could just be enough for Lando at the end of the season to take this title, bearing in mind it's 4 Grand Prix plus the 2 sprints. So if all plays out, and if Max is finishing fifth in every single race, if everybody, as I say, ahead of him, Ferrari and McLaren, get both cars across the line, then it could just be the differentiator. So that's why he's hammering Red Bull post-race, as he did in Mexico City, saying, this car isn't good enough, guys, race pace-wise. We've got to do something. But I don't think Red Bull has got anything left in its locker to give him that, from everything that I understand at the moment.
And of course, this weekend in Brazil is one of those final 2 sprint weekends, meaning there are 34 points available potentially to the driver that wins both. And that could be another big swing. 10 points from Max to Lando. It was a big deficit for Max to take. And obviously 47 points now, the gap between the two. And for me, leading on to my final question about Max and Lando, for me, the 50-point mark is vital, because obviously if you take away the sprint format and the fastest lap point, 50 points is effectively, that's 2 race wins. Lando is now within that 47 points. And it's now the point where actually just one DNF for Max or one race outside the points could have a massive, massive change. So with that in mind, 4 races to go, 2 sprints. A question to both of you: is the driver's title fight back on?
Go for it, Sam.
Yes, I think it is. And I'll borrow from Ian's point that he made earlier in terms of that, if there's a DNF for Max in the next 3 rounds, and again, to couple that with a point I made in past podcasts, you only need to be within 25 points or so come that final race, and then anything can happen. Yes, the odds will still be stacked against Lando, no doubt. But what if there is something that happens in Abu Dhabi and Max doesn't have that buffer and the championships have gone to the wire? It could feasibly happen. So that for that reason, yes, the championship could be back on. It could be back on. It's still highly unlikely that it's going to look close when all is said and done. Years down the line, someone will look at the Wikipedia page for this season and go, "Oh, he won it by 45 points, easy." But actually, that doesn't tell the story of the pressure and of the swings and the peaks and troughs that you experience over these final few rounds. So often these title fights go far longer than you'd expect in a dominant season. So for a season where Max, he hasn't won in 10 races. Roughly a year ago, he'd just won 10 in a row. It's a huge swing. So that's why I think the title fight is still just about on.
Ian?
It is, quite obviously, because there's what is it? What did we work out? 120 points up for grabs across these 4 Grand Prix and 2 sprints, with the fastest lap points, of course, attached to the Grand Prix. And it's a 47-point gap. So absolutely, there is a title fight. The one saving grace for Max is Ferrari.
Next talking point.
Because that is the team that all of a sudden now has shot to the fore over these past 2 Grand Prix in particular, with the points that it's scored, thrust itself into contention in Constructors' Championship. But what it is doing in Max's favour is taking points off Lando Norris in particular. Without that, then I think the points gap will be even closer right now than it is. So, Ferrari are going to do 1-2s, 1-3s, and Lando is only doing 2s, 4s, or whatever. Then Max is going to take this title by crawling over the line effectively. And he'll be paying a big thanks to Ferrari at the end of it because of what they are achieving at the moment. And it looks like there's no slowing them down. The only way that they could possibly falter now, Ferrari, is if McLaren suddenly again finds something else. And we saw it had a new floor in Mexico City. Oscar Piastri will have that new floor now on the car in Brazil. It offered a minimal gain, very minimal as far as Lando Norris was concerned, but it was still something else on that car to help them fight. But yes, without a shadow of a doubt, for me, the title fight is on in the drivers. The title fight is definitely on in the constructors. However, I think it has become now a 2-horse race, and a different 2-horse race compared to how it was a few races ago. And it's the McLaren versus Ferrari. I don't think Red Bull are in the running now for that particular championship.
And that is a beautiful transition to Ferrari, because what form the Scuderia, what form the Scuderia are on, and actually you hit the nail on the head that actually Ferrari are the big spanner of the work now for Norris, because actually, Mexico City, it was Carlos who scored more points than Lando. In Texas, it was both Carlos and Charles. But crucially for me, and you mentioned there that it's now become a 2-horse fight between McLaren and Ferrari. Ferrari jumped ahead of Red Bull after finishing first and third last weekend. They're now only 29 points behind McLaren. And I'm going to say something quite bold before making our bold predictions for this weekend, is that Ferrari, in my eyes, have gone from being the underdog in the Constructors' title to the dark horses. I think they're now the favourites. Sam?
I like the boldness. I like it a lot. And I see the logic in it. It's still a 29-point gap to bridge. It's still, a fair difference there. But there is certainly credit in what you're saying, because let's look at Oscar Piastri for a second. He hasn't been delivering the last few rounds in the way that you'd expect, particularly in qualifying. And it sounds really strange to say this, because Mexico was the first time all season he hasn't reached Q3, but it has been in the Grand Prix, might I caveat. It hasn't been his strongest point at times. And when everyone is so close, he needs to be up there with Lando to fight the Ferraris, because the Ferraris are really, bringing it week in, week out at the moment. So that's where it could be decided in some ways. And that feels incredibly harsh on Oscar, because he's delivering so well in just his second season. But yeah, we've seen that last 2-3 races, Lando's up there by himself at the moment. So that is where I think there's certainly some virtue in what you're saying. I don't think I'd go as far as saying they're the favourites, but they're certainly the team with momentum. Ferrari.
A bit different for you, Ian, because obviously an issue we've seen with Ferrari in the past when they've gotten into these brilliant positions of having one of the strongest cars, if not the strongest. I do still think McLaren has the better car, but the big issue for Ferrari in the past has been doing this consistently winning races, consistently having both cars on the podium. Of course, compared to the last time they were in this position, very different leadership now under Fred Vasseur. But do you think the team now has the guidance and is in a position where, I know it's impossible to predict going into the next 4 races, the final 4 races, but do you believe Ferrari do have at least what it takes within the team now compared to the past to be able to continue delivering these results on a consistent basis until the end of the season?
Yes, simply because we're not going to see now being brought to the cars in terms of major upgrades or updates. Because that time has gone, the money has obviously, in terms of the budget cap, is now dwindled, depleted. So I think what we're seeing, there might be something over the 2-week gap after Brazil that, we might get the odd incremental update here going into the final triple header. But definitely momentum is now on Ferrari's side. And I think from what I know about Fred, and I've got a very good relationship with him, I'd like to say I'm not blowing any trumpets there or anything. I do get on well with Fred. And he's a character. And I think what he has done over the period of time that he has been in charge, he's brought that character into Ferrari. Previously, it was a very structured, very regimented team. It had a certain way of doing things, almost like the Ferrari way of doing things, if you want to attach a phrase to it. And when Fred came in, there were eyebrows raised. Oh, who is he? What has he done? What has he ever achieved? There was a little bit of that. I think it was a little bit unfair as well. But Fred has changed things over a period of time. And now we're starting to see the fruits of that labour. And it's a very more relaxed Ferrari compared to the way it used to be. You only got to see, saw some comments leading into the Mexico City Grand Prix, that the entire team went out for a night out, in Mexico City, big dinner, quite unusual. I don't think that would have happened pre-Vasseur days. It would have been very much heads down, we're focused, we've got the constructors title to fight for. But no, Fred is instilled this, as I say, this his character within the team, and I think that now is coming to the fore. People are a little bit more relaxed about their roles, their jobs, and again, he's managed to structure things differently within the organisation, and it's now very much coming together, and that's what we're now seeing within the cars and on the track, and with its two drivers as well, Carlos and Charles.
And it was, of course, a spectacular victory for Carlos. He was saying going after Texas into Mexico, they just wanted one final win. Ferrari, almost a Mercedes, that would have been wrong. That's because Mercedes are our next talking point, but he got his final win for Ferrari. And as I was saying to Ian, Sam, in the F1 update, actually, it wouldn't surprise me if he gets another in the final 4 races because he is on this brilliant form. Do you think a piece of him now is going to be thinking, in his head, almost saying to Ferrari, come on, do you see what you're losing here?
I do. And he's actually kind of not vocalized it in such, but he's spoken about how bittersweet it is and how I think he used the phrase, a not good feeling about potentially watching Ferrari battle for championships next year when he was there to prepare them for that moment. And that's got to be a bitter pill to swallow. You can only imagine what that's like for him, and it will be next year when he's down in the midfield, going, oh yeah, Lewis and Charles fighting for wins. That could have been me. I've proven that I can win. I think he absolutely will want to make the most of these 4 rounds, but it's going to be difficult for him to process, I think, over the winter and next year, that he's had that taken away when he didn't really do much to lose his seat. It was just that they had the opportunity to sign a 7-time world champion. Like, it's definitely a pull factor on Lewis's side than a pushing Carlos out factor. So yeah, it's a really interesting situation in that sense, because that very rarely is the case with a second driver, quote unquote, and particularly at a team like Ferrari.
And you've got to be thinking now that Lewis Hamilton is probably in secret licking his lips a little bit, seeing what Ferrari are doing, because it does look like he's going to do what he did when he went from McLaren to Mercedes and is going to jump into an incredible package. Of course, didn't happen initially at Mercedes, but was in the right place at the right time going into the hybrid era. But it looks like the same is going to happen with Ferrari. And I guess that's a good thing when, yes, okay, he got the better of George Russell in Mexico City, but, a great tussle between the two Mercedes drivers, which lasted several laps. But again, Mercedes, 4th and 5th, well off the podium places, well off McLaren and Ferrari. And again, no man's land, Ian.
You've just used the phrase that I was going to use. No man's land in the Mexico City Grand Prix, as you say, just fighting amongst themselves for the minor places, and no man's land in the Constructors' Championship. They're miles adrift of the top 3, and they're miles ahead of the team behind them, which is Aston Martin.
Yeah.
So very strange situation for Mercedes that they find themselves in as a team. And you can imagine that over the rest of this season, they've pretty much already got most of their focus now on 2025 and what can they do to address the performance of this W15 that will give them a fighting chance with a new driver lineup next season with its W16. Just following logic in terms of what they're likely to going to call the car next year.
Oh, could you imagine if they didn't call it that?
I'm not giving anything. I don't think I'm giving any secrets away there as to what Mercedes are likely going to call its car for 2025. But yeah, George Russell, Kimi Antonelli, new driver partnership. They've got 4 races to basically sort out the issues with this car, as I say, to at least make sure it's going to be in the mix across 2025, because if Mercedes can do that, then we could have one of the greatest seasons in 2025 that we will have seen for a very, very long time, because I've no doubt Red Bull will come fighting back next season. And with Ferrari and McLaren where they are right now, we could be going into every single Grand Prix next year really not knowing which team, which driver combination is going to come out with the Grand Prix victory, who's going to be on the podium, because it's going to be a 4-way tussle every single race. Now, wouldn't that be something to look forward to?
And what's really interesting on the topic of no man's land is obviously Mercedes is very much in that position of being in no man's land. And actually, I've got a feeling that coming out of Brazil this weekend, Red Bull will be in the same position in 3rd in the standings. And yes, okay, that's partly due to the issues they're having with the RB20 and it not being the car it was at the start of the year. But it's also massively to do with Sergio Perez, who, again, at his home race, a massive shocker out in Q1, simply not good enough pace. He then managed to start the race quite comfortably ahead of his grid box, resulting in a 5-second time penalty. Then had obviously the collisions with Liam Lawson, which was deemed as a racing incident, no further action taken. But of course, at turns 4, turn 5, Sam, you started to mention it earlier in the podcast. And of course, that incident was pivotal to Checo's race because it resulted in him sustaining significant floor damage, significant side pod damage, to the point that he effectively was in running the rest of the race at the back of the field. He's adamant that he'll be in the Mexico City Grand Prix next year, has no concerns whatsoever. It's still his dream to win that race. But, I mean, he was given the finger by Liam Lawson for the incident. Liam has since apologised for that bit in particular, not actually the turn 4, turn 5 incident. But, I mean, what do Red Bull do now? Because it's quite clearly too late in the day to, even if they were to replace Checo, I don't think it's going to happen, but if they were to replace him, Ferrari and McLaren are clearly too strong. Red Bull, it looks like it's going to be 3rd best for them in the standings. What do they do?
I would make the change now.
It's exactly what he said last week. I'm just going to very quickly jump in because Sam made this point. He was confident that Red Bull would replace Perez ahead of the Brazilian Grand Prix. So carry on, mate.
I remain confident. I mean, it's difficult because it's a triple header. And so, yeah, actually, now I think about it more, logic would suggest you'd change before the final triple header, not right before Brazil. But either way, I think, welcome back, Daniel Ricciardo. No, I'm joking.
Well, it's an interesting point.
But this is the thing, right? Do you pull Isaac Hadjar out of his F2 championship fight? I mean, you got to guess that he'd go, yeah, you know what, I'll cede the title so I can have a go in an RB. Absolutely, you would, because it's an opportunity for him to cement a seat next season. But anyway, I'm getting off the immediate point.
Leave us two alone.
Clearly some tangents here that, it's a multifaceted situation. But I think from Sergio Perez's perspective, there's a level of deny, like give no inch. He's obviously going to come out and say, no, I'll be here next year. Because as soon as he wavers on that will get latched upon by the Piranha Club, or at least the people who, the piranhas who report on the Piranha Club, should I say. And yeah, ultimately, F1 and the paddock is a vicious place at times. So that's why he has been so steadfast in, I'm going to be here next year. I'm not going to give you anything that you can possibly pick up on. But he must know that he is really, really at the end of that tether. Red Bull have said that we'll give you to the end of the year, but I just don't see how they can at this point, because you've got the opportunity to bed Liam in early. If it is Liam, it looks like it's going to be Liam. Helmut Marko was particularly unhappy with Yuki Tsunoda over the weekend, called him unstable or lacking the stability they thought that he had after his qualifying crash. So,
Yuki.
Well, that's the thing. It's funny how quickly these narratives can shift.
And he's got the Red Bull test into the season as well, Yuki.
He does. So yeah, I think there's a good chance that Red Bull are still saying, look, we're going to assess at the end of the year. But I think why not make the change sooner? Get ready for 2025 when you can fight for something.
But this is another case in a way of Red Bull slightly shooting themselves in the foot, because obviously it look quite weirdy, and given that it was during the Mexico City race on Sunday, you had Liam and Checo coming together. You then had the incident of Liam obviously pointing his middle finger towards Sergio, which again he has apologised for, but that in itself it is a big no-no.
Will he get a penalty for that? Will he get community, like Charles Leclerc? Will they get community service? Exactly.
For swearing during the FIA press conference after the race.
I see some consistency here.
But do you think, Ian, has Red Bull shot itself in the foot a little bit? But given that it was Liam of all drivers who was involved in the incident with Checo, and of course then the whole middle finger thing, which again, yes, that shows a sign of inexperience and the fact he's a young driver, but perhaps doesn't paint the best image if he were to then get promoted for the final few races.
Red Bull had the opportunity to make a decision after the Belgian Grand Prix.
Yeah.
And it decided steadfastly to continue with Checo Perez. Christian Horner made an announcement at the factory in Milton Keynes on the Monday after the Belgian Grand Prix saying Checo will be our driver through to the end of the season. So he now, if they decide to make a decision at this very late stage, he's going to look very red-faced on the back of that call. There's still time to do it. From what I gather, Christian in his post-race press conference would not nail shut the possibility that there could be a change before the end of the season. And Checo Perez very much, both before and after the Mexico City Grand Prix, looked like a driver that was pretty much saying farewell to his fans. I mean, I recall his comment when he was interviewed pre-race, and he said he was standing in the stadium section, and he turned around and said, it's at moments like these where I look back on my career and I, thank all the fans that have supported me. And it was like, that sounded very much like a farewell speech in my book. Is it a farewell speech that he's going now with 4 races to go? Or is it a farewell speech that this is it, this is his final season with Red Bull, and almost likely his final season in Formula One, because there's nowhere else to go. So it's going to be a tough call for Helmut and Christian to make if they do decide to do yet another driver change. The only mitigating factor is that they have a car that right now cannot win races. That's fundamentally clear, even at the hands of, let's face it, one of the greatest drivers of all time in Max Verstappen. It cannot win races. It doesn't have the race pace of Ferrari and McLaren. So if you make that driver change in a bid to try and haul yourselves back into the Constructors' Championship. And I say haul yourselves back in, they are still in it, albeit they have fallen now a good chunk of points adrift of McLaren. Is it going to work? Because if all Max is doing is fighting for the minor places off the podium, then what is another driver going to do at the hands of that car other than, as Sam has pointed out, being bedded in for 2025? That's the only positive that you could possibly gain out of it, because it looks, and as I've stated, that the Constructors' title has gone for Red Bull this season because they simply do not have the car. So there's a lot to weigh up inside Red Bull if they are going to make a change now or even after the Sao Paulo Grand Prix for that last triple header. Go on, Sam.
Do you think second place is completely done or out of reach? So, because I mean, I get the thinking that obviously Ferrari and McLaren are so strong that they will only push on from here. But I guess the concern for Red Bull is what happens if they get to the final few rounds and for whatever reason they are competitive again and they're going, oh, we should have made that change. You know, that would have saved us money. That would have at least got second, if not first. We look a bit silly now. And ultimately, Red Bull, when it comes to spin, when it comes to media handling, I mean, Red Bull is a marketing company that makes energy drinks at the end of the day. It has moved on so far from what it initially was. You know, it has a sports empire, for goodness sake. It's an entirely different monster compared to, you know, some of these huge brands that it's competing against. So I trust that Red Bull would be able to twist that narrative in a way that kind of fits their needs. And again, going back to that kind of deny, I'm sure they'd find a way of twisting those comments from the summer in some way to be like, well, you know, kind of actually it was a suggestion, or I don't know, I'm not a PR person. I'm very much on the other side of the fence when it comes to those matters. But yeah, so I don't know, it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, from Sergio Perez's perspective, just to end on this point on that, Nick, you listed a catalogue of issues or errors over this weekend. And I think Liam was maybe lucky not to get a penalty because, yeah, he, at least at turn 5, well, he was moving on to braking at turn 4, and at turn 5, he did push Sergio off and he made contact in the process. However, with the same brush, was Sergio not lucky to avoid a penalty for the Stroll incident? So, you know, it's back and forth here. So yeah, it was I particularly enjoyed when you said he was comfortably clear of his grid slot. For whatever reason, that really tickled me, that expression.
I mean, he was, but just in case Red Bull do announce something, let's quickly get through our last couple of points because otherwise we'll have to restart this podcast. And it's been a good episode, so I don't really want to do that. One final question for both of you. Sam, I'll bring the first point to you. And Haas, a team obviously who is changing drivers next season, its entire lineup, but 7th for Kevin Magnussen, 9th for Nico Hulkenberg. In terms of size, Haas is obviously one of the smallest teams on the grid, and it's remarkable. They've moved 10 points clear of RB in 6th in the standings. Aston Martin, think of the size of them now, are 40 points ahead, which is a big margin to try and make up for a midfield team. But yeah, it's a pretty incredible story because Haas are another team who've got under a significant leadership change and are having the season of their lives.
They really are. And you've got to credit Ayo Komatsu for what he has managed to do at that team. And maybe this because I listened, and Ian will touch upon this as well, no doubt. I listened to Ian's exclusive interview with Komatsu over the summer. And I was sitting there going, no, I'm buying into this. Like, absolutely, this guy is the real deal.
How do I get a share?
Well, exactly. What he has managed to do with so little comparatively to the likes of Aston Martin and move so far clear of RB with 4 rounds to go, that's 10 points. That's going to be really difficult for RB to overturn. So what he's managed to achieve is fantastic. And next year, they're going to have to try and build on that with an entirely new driver lineup. That's going to be difficult. Kevin Magnussen's had a really good few rounds. I don't think they're going to regret anything when it comes to the driver lineup, other than losing Nico Hulkenberg, obviously. But Kevin's been far too inconsistent throughout his career to warrant them going, oh, we've really messed up here. But yeah, I think I can't explain how they've turned it around. I mean, Okamatsu did a really good job in his interview with Ian, but it's a really process-driven approach. And yeah, he's managed to really increase the efficiency of a really small team. And you're seeing that on track through the upgrades and just how the team is now operating.
Anything to add, Ian? Because you do speak to IO.
I just do what the drivers do sometimes in FIA press conferences. You just go with what he said. There you go.
All right, in that case, then I'll come to you on the final talking point before we do our bold predictions. And obviously, one driver who didn't have a Mexico City Grand Prix to remember, but is now going into perhaps the biggest weekend of their life, is Franco Colapinto. Of course, the Sao Paulo Grand Prix in Brazil is the closest he's going to get to a home race, obviously being from Argentina. I mean, we know there's going to be the Ayrton Senna celebrations this weekend. Of course, Lewis Hamilton is also a bit of a hero in Brazil, being the honorary citizen. But I mean, for Franco, this is going to be the weekend of his life. It is going to be just insane for him.
Yeah, quite naturally, and he's talked about it to a certain extent as well already, because as you say, Nick, this is as close as he's ever going to get to having a home Grand Prix, and even then, we're talking a good chunk of distance away.
Yeah.
So
it's the right continent.
It's the right continent, at least.
It's a big continent, though.
It's a big continent, but at least it's the right continent. Yeah, there was a degree of support from obviously Mexico City, but this is going to crank up a notch. And in many respects now, he's going to go into that under a little bit of pressure because, as you say, his performance for the first time since stepping into that Williams wasn't the greatest. It was a tough weekend for him in Mexico City. We saw a little bit of the blotting of the copybook, shall we say. And he's come out of that now with a degree of pressure on his shoulders that now he's got to show what he can do in terms of bouncing back, because it's been this great story, a lot of hype around him, and rightly so, and huge furore in Argentina about his presence on the grid and within Williams. Could he have a seat for next season? Even being spoken about going to RB for next season, which I believe is one of the paddock rumors in Mexico City. So that gives you some idea as to just how swiftly the narrative has moved on with regard to Franco since jumping into that Williams seat after Logan Sargent was sacked. But yeah, as I say, blotted his copybook in Mexico City. Now we've got to see, okay, what is Franco Colapinto all about? Can he bounce back from that? Can he prove that all the hype that has been around him so far is justified, and he can have a great Sao Paulo Grand Prix where he knows he's going to have a considerable amount of support?
Which brings us nicely onto our bold predictions for the Sao Paulo Grand Prix. I'll give you two a few seconds to think and I'll kick things off. I'm going to say another Ferrari win, but also another big haul of points for Haas. Sam, over to you.
I like to be contrarian, as I think you both know. By this
Here
point.
We go.
And also, I like to have ridiculous bold predictions. But I don't think this is that bold. But I think Max will extend his championship lead in Sao Paulo.
Interesting.
I think he'll have
penalty. Throwing that one into the mix there. You forgot that little hand grenade, didn't you?
Yeah.
Because obviously the feeling is that Max is going to take a power unit penalty.
Yeah.
So obviously, yes, he's going to have a brand new power unit in the back of that RB, and it's going to give him a hell of a lot of power. We saw what Lewis Hamilton did with a brand new power unit at the back of his Mercedes a few years ago when he came from the back of the grid and produced one hell of a performance. So can we expect something similar from Red Bull and Max? But I just wanted to throw that in there when you said he's going to extend his lead.
It's a good point, and I'm going to stick with it because I'm a man of conviction, and you've just made it even more bold. So I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to go with it because Lando could also have a retirement or something like that. It could be Max could score 2 points and still extend his championship lead. So I'm going to stick with it. I privately, although I'm saying it now on the podcast, lost faith now because I didn't consider the penalty, even though it's looking like it's going to be.
Here we go.
But I'm going to stick with it.
Ian, bring us home.
I don't see Max being on the podium at all, even if he does have a power unit penalty. I just think, as has been pointed out, the race pace of that car is just not there. I just don't think it's going to be a car either that's going to be suited to the São Paulo circuit, Interlagos. So yeah, I think it's going to be another difficult weekend for Max, and I think we're going to. I'm going to be contrary now to Sam, and I think we're going to see a further erosion of his lead over Lando Norris. I do think Lando is going to make gains. How significant, I'm not quite sure. Bearing in mind we do have the sprint and the Grand Prix, so 34 points up for grabs over the course of the weekend. But I do think we are going to see a further erosion of that lead, and I do think it's going to make it really interesting going into that last triple header, Vegas, Qatar, Abu Dhabi. Will it go all the way to the wire in Abu Dhabi? I think it just might, but I think Max is going to go into that with a very substantial lead, but one that could just about be overhauled by Lando given the right set of circumstances. So looking even further ahead and making quite a bold prediction there. Never mind Sao Paulo, I'm looking ahead towards Abu Dhabi.
And of course, the weather can also play a part in Sao Paulo. We've seen that in the past. Amazing stuff, as always. And of course, for those who are watching this podcast on YouTube, let us know any thoughts of yours from this episode in the comment section below, and let us know your bold predictions for this weekend in Brazil. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, please. This has been the latest episode of the Racing News 365.com podcast from Sam, Ian and I. We will see you this weekend for the Sao Paulo Grand Prix. See you later.
And as always, take care, folks.
Thanks for joining us.